Hey everybody, how's it going? Let's talk about visual patterns in poetry. If you remember, initially we talked about patterns and how patterns is basically the repetition of elements in a poem. So visual patterns really have to do with how, or more specifically, what that pattern is in a poem. There can be different types of patterns. So I'm just going to walk you through the page here, but I definitely want you to read it and to look at it on your own, but I'll kind of talk you through it as well. So the first pattern that we can look at is a verbal pattern. A verbal pattern is basically the repetition of a word or certain words or phrases, or even like certain like letter configurations is what it says in your example, but you might think of like alliteration or assonance, like the repetition of some sounds that are spelt or words that are spelt similarly. So in the example they give, it's a repetition of the word of the same word in the opening line of each stanza. So that would be a verbal pattern because it's a repetition of words or word choice. There can also be grammatical patterns. So where a verbal pattern is focused on like an individual word and how that's repeated. A grammatical pattern is focused more on how an author constructs a sentence or constructs a portion of a sentence using repeated phrases or punctuation. So again, in the example, all the lines start with the same word, but they lead to independent clauses. And so that would be an example of a grammatical pattern. They also mentioned that italics, bold-facing, capitalization is another example of a grammatical pattern. So we see grammatical patterns Ruby Kaur's poems because she does not capitalize personal pronouns. So it would be an example of a grammatical pattern that she uses. Syntactical patterns come basically when lines are constructed very similarly to the point where maybe just a couple of words are changed. But like the sentence itself, or I mean the line itself, is largely the same sentence structure, or the structure of the line is very similar. So take a look at the example on the page there for syntactical patterns. It could be the exact same sentence that's repeated, right? In Langston Hughes's poem, we see the same sentence being repeated over and over again, and that would be an example of a syntactical pattern. Linear patterns focus on the poetic line. So that one's a little bit easier to remember because the pattern is in the name, the line. So how does the lines end? Are they end stopped? Are they end jammed? Are they end paused? How long are they visually? Is it like one line that just extends really far? Are all the lines lined up together? Is it short, long, visually? How does that look? So linear patterns have to do with each of the poetic lines and how do those lines create meaning or create a pattern, excuse me. Stanzaic patterns have to do with stanzas themselves. So how are stanzas constructed? So a stanza would be like the small paragraph looking thing in a poem, and then there's a break and there's some more lines. That's a stanza. And so how does the construction of stanzas create a pattern or not in a poem would be part of the pattern that you could look at. Okay, so again, all of this has to do with patterns and identifying visual patterns in poetry. Again, and the goal here is once you identify a pattern, you can see how does that pattern help the author create the meaning behind the poem. Okay. As always, let me know if you have questions.